What is a lie of omission? It's the part of the story that you won't hear on the nightly news. It's the way scandals are covered up or created depending on whether the media likes or dislikes a particular politician. It's the way the citizens are kept under control when bankers steal trillions of tax dollars. The people in this documentary have been uncovering lies of omission for decades on both sides of the aisle and have even uncovered a scandal or two. But you've never heard their names or seen their faces on the news because fake news organizations are experts at lies of omission.
When I was a child, for 5 years, from 60 to 65, my family lived in Tehran, Iran. I used to ride around on my bicycle in, like it looked like a setting like Indiana Jones might show up in.
I've always been political. My mom was an ardent, rabid Democrat. We had a joke around the house that no Republicans were allowed in the house. My grandpa on my mom's side ran for office as a socialist.
I went to the University of Virginia in the 70s, was commissioned as a naval officer in 1979, and went from there to BUDS training, which is the pipeline for SEAL teams. So I was an officer in SEAL teams in my early 20s.
Well, I grew up pretty much a typical suburban sort of guy in South Jersey.
We grew up in northern Wisconsin on a river. And so all summer, every summer was Huck Finn. Barefoot, filthy, gallon ice cream buckets with various forms of nature growing in the garage.
What I want is the country that I grew up in, minus the racism and discrimination, obviously, of the 50s and 60s, certainly.
For the people in this film, they might have had a life like many others, but something, at some time, would motivate them to action and activism.
What was a specific moment that motivated you to be an activist?
I got caught up in an incident, and I was running a small pharmaceutical manufacturing facility in Gardena, California. We had to put on a second shift due to a contract that didn't give me much time to go through normal hiring practices. So we had to bring in a lot of people that unfortunately did not work out, some of them with problematic backgrounds that required terminating. That didn't go over well with a couple of them who it turned out had gang ties, and they made a death threat against me. So I asked the investigating officer, what am I supposed to do? And he looked at me with his partner standing right there for plausible deniability that he ever said it. And he said, sir, if I were you, I would carry a gun. You're trained professionals. I gave the only one's argument to him. You guys know what to do and when to do it because you've got the training. What do I know? I might panic and shoot somebody because the situation doesn't warrant it, but I'm just scared. And he looked over at his partner, and his partner looked back at him, and I could tell they were just kind of shaking their head going, this guy just doesn't get it. And it was almost like an epiphany. And I thought, wait a minute. Yeah, I get it. And yeah, it's up to me.
Well, I don't quite think of myself as an activist. I think of activists as the people who go out and storm the barricades and go to the protests and write the letters. While I'm not knocking anybody who goes out and tries to get out the vote or fights for an initiative. I'm definitely not knocking him. My particular activism, which I won't call activism, is saying, here's what you can do for yourself, for your family, for your community, for fundamental rights.
You know, I'm older, and I feel like I have some observations to impart, maybe a little bit of some historical understanding. I see a lot of, you know, flashing warning signs right now, like big trouble straight ahead, and I feel like it's kind of my duty. It's one of my motivations for writing my novels, especially the Enemies Foreign and Domestic. You know, more than a dozen years ago. It starts with a false flag operation. You know, it's a shooter, a sniper shooting into a stadium, causing a panic stampede. But it's not really. It's completely a patsy. It's sold as, you know, a right-wing militia kook in order to disarm, you know, the Americans as an excuse to, you know, outlaw semi-automatic weapons. But I kind of wanted people to start thinking in terms of false flag operations, things like that. Mainly because I even 15, 20 years ago, I saw this trend, this drift towards tyranny. You know, it's stark when you say it that way, but look where we are now.
I've been privileged to be an activist who got paid. Most activists who are fighting for freedom have to do it after dinner, take a day off, and they're fighting people that our taxes have paid to fight against.
How many years have you been doing this?
Pushing 40. Not the first rodeo, we can say that.
I think people have this, the word activist, I guess, is kind of a misnomer because people think, oh, activist, they immediately think of bottle throwing and burning things. And no, what is an activist? It's somebody who acts on behalf of or in support of something. And I think a lot of us are activists in that we actively work toward a goal. And that goal is individual liberty and individual self-determination, where you have the power to make choices for your own life, which is not something that we have right now.
In 2014, Cliven Bundy's resistance to an abusive federal government inspired an amazing number of patriots to come to Nevada to defend him and his family from armed agents.
So, Bunkerville, why exactly was he getting...
Cliven Bundy and his family had ranched, had grazed cattle primarily on this scrubby terrain for decades. In fact, his family had been there before there was a Bureau of Land Management, which was the particular agency that was hassling his family. And they had contractual rights to use watering holes and grazing lands that the federal government was just running roughshod over. And the federal government had run all of Bundy's neighbors out. 24 of his neighbors had just been forced off their land. Bundy wasn't leaving. And that drove the control freaks in Washington crazy. And so they came on him with armed federal agents, and the family holed up and eventually was reinforced initially by neighbors, people in the state, and ultimately people were coming from all over the United States to defend Cliven Bundy against an overreaching federal government.
Everybody understood that the government was willing to use whatever force it took to shut the Bundys up and get them to knuckle under their will, which is why the 3%ers responded, I mean, here again, beautifully, responding as a movement. And remember that the prime directive of the 3%ers, no more free Wacos. You don't get to kill American citizens without due process of law, without somebody else like us getting in the middle between you and your intended victims.
Constitutional regime that was established to release the energy of the people, initially to free us from the regulatory excesses of King George, who tried to enforce his excesses with soldiers, and we know how that turned out. And that's why we have a Second Amendment, because we were born learning that ultimately a regulatory excess might need to be countered by an armed people.
The 3% is a concept and a movement, it's not an organization. So many people claim to be 3%ers who've never read a word that I've said. Yet it's obvious that the idea has spread to so many places. It's weaponized. I mean, literally, the 3% idea is weaponized. It's potent. People are acting upon it, sometimes in ways that I don't approve of.
When I was with the NRA Members Council in Los Angeles, and I was living in Manhattan Beach at the time, Sarah Brady and our then Congresswoman Jane Harmon held a big gun fest at the local park where we would take our kids on strollers. So it was my park. I was doing the newsletter and I went down to cover it, and they had all these tables lined up with guns to try to convince everybody that guns were bad. And I wanted to ask a question because they were holding a press conference and the news was asking them questions, and I had a question too. And I raised my hand and said, excuse me, but you're saying that 250,000 felons have been stopped by the Brady Act from buying guns, meaning that they tried to buy a gun and they were turned back by your Brady system. Well, that's a crime for a felon to try to buy a gun. Okay, so how many prosecutions have resulted from this? Okay, seems a simple enough question. They ignored me. I asked it again, at which point a guy in a suit from a group of officers and police dignitaries walked up to me and told me, you're not a journalist and what you're doing is not protected by free speech. At which point I said, oh really? I said, I invite you to cuff me and to take me out of here, and we'll see about that. And he, like this, and he walked back, and they left me alone after that. It was funny because he told me that I was not an authorized journalist. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, I need a government license and government approval to be a recognized journalist in the land of the First Amendment? Are you kidding me?
You're known for making the statement, we are at that awkward stage where it's too late to work within the system, but it's too early to shoot the bastard. What inspired you to make such a statement?
It was the last moment that I was involved in electoral politics, the last moment that I was involved in politics as usual, doing the kind of things that your civics teachers tell you in school. I had about gotten fed up with politics, but the congressional race in my district this particular year was very, very interesting. And friends of mine had pulled a candidate out of a hat, and she was wonderful, fabulous. This woman was just everything you want a candidate to be. And I had the personal opportunity to grill her for several hours and find out, yes, she was just where she needed to be on every position, and where she wasn't, that was fine. We could agree to disagree. She won a seat in the U.S. Congress by practically a miracle. And within 30 days, she had betrayed everything she claimed to stand for and all of the people that she claimed to represent. And she was telling us we simply didn't understand how things were done in Washington. So she was representing the government to us and not representing us to the government. And that was the thing that made me realize that business as usual was never going to work, that all those things that our school teachers told us were not the real way to get things done.
As a Navy SEAL officer, we were trained to go in and out of any country at will, that there really is only 1% of the country that is watched and 99% of the border is unwatched. So our bread and butter was going in and out of other countries without anybody knowing about it, which for me popped the bubble about this, the omnipotence of a government. Oh, the law says you have to turn your rifle in. Well, it won't work. And it certainly won't work in this country.
I became aware of the importance of firearms when I was living with my young family in a Maryland suburb just outside the District of Columbia. I was still going to college, and there were riots. The year was 1968. The city was burning, and the police were pretty candid, and they said, we don't know that we can guarantee that the rioters can be contained in town, and they might be leaving throughout some of the main arteries out of town. Well, we lived a few houses off one of those main arteries. And I went to a sporting goods store and I bought a shotgun, and not knowing what I was doing, I bought a pretty good one in spite of my ignorance. And I figured you don't need to be Annie Oakley with a shotgun if you're being attacked by a mob out marauding. And that was my first gun. And I didn't even realize that it was a part of the Second Amendment. When the government can't or won't protect the citizenry, that's what the citizenry are able to do.
There was a law that passed about universal background checks in Washington that got me involved in a very direct, physical way, going to rallies, defying the law, all of that. But really, the positions that I have, they weren't something I was indoctrinated into. They weren't something that I was taught in school. They were something that came as a result of not having these positions, coming from a totally different viewpoint. And over time, I got these facts, and they didn't work with what I believed at the time. And there's a saying that I really love, and it's, when an honest but ignorant man is given truth, he either ceases to be ignorant or he ceases to be honest. And you come to this point where you've got facts in your face and you've got what you believe. And you can do one of two things. You can either take those facts and incorporate them into what you believe, say, well, now I know better and I have to change my belief. Or you say, well, I don't care about the facts. Well, now what have you done? You've been given truth and you've chosen to disregard it. And now you're in a whole other ball game.
The thing that changed my life utterly was my experience with the good doctor. 1976, I was a hospital aide. I was taking care of patients in neurosurgery. And I encountered the most remarkable man, Dr. Richter. I had been interacting with him. I found him fascinating. So here I am, this killer tomato who's done various and sundry illegal things for his own Maoist Communist Party. And this guy is trying to get me to embrace the history of my own country. Well, that's good for an argument where I come from. And he knew that. He said, I know you're a fast reader. He says, I want you to read this, and then we'll talk about it. And he pulled out a copy. It was a 1943 edition, first edition English edition of The Road to Serfdom by the Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek. Basically, Hayek's thesis was that all so-called planned economies are essentially collectivist and dictatorial in nature. That the only true liberty that can be found, economic liberty, from which political liberty flows, is in free men, free markets, and the government to secure the rule of law and nothing else, not outcomes.
The fact that a Republican president proposed and passed the Patriot Act did nothing to dampen their dedication to identify abuses of government and expose them too. It's a dedication to individual liberty that drives their motives, not partisanship.
The philosophical basis of the 3% actually draws from the threat that people like George W. Bush presented to the Constitution. And of course, the Patriot Act was perhaps absolute proof of that.
Criminal investigation and legitimate intelligence gathering overseas, for instance, could do anything needed to stop terrorism. We have the Patriot Act instead, which allows spying on all of us, that assumes, that I'm a terrorist, you're a terrorist, the people watching this film were terrorists, because otherwise, why would they be surveilling us?
But the bottom line is that somehow or other, this little camera on the back of my computer here isn't monitoring us and sending things back to some spook somewhere who's looking for some way to make up some kind of charges and get me into the Patriot Act to where they can bring us in and not even tell me what the charges are or not give it to a lawyer. And I mean, it just turns into this Orwellian dystopian nightmare that is not supposed to be the United States of America.
And I feel really bad for the FBI agents with integrity that they're now working for a shop that's corrupt. But this is what Marxists do. They don't, since 1917 at least, or maybe 1959 in Cuba, they don't come into town waving a red flag with a hammer and sickle on it. They know that's not going to work. What you do is you have the same goal, but you mouth and parrot Constitution, law. It's just that under the table, it's all a sham. The way it was in the USSR, where they also had a constitution, but everybody knew it was just, meaningless words on paper. That's pretty much where we are now.
Because they are focused on what's right here, they're giving up things that are important out there. And it's convenient to them to be able to have their photos on Google and their GPS Google Maps and Google everything. It's so convenient. Our smartphones, we live in our smartphones, and we don't pay attention because we're concerned about right now, instant gratification. What's going to be easiest and most convenient for me right now, because we've given that up. In favor of convenience, we've given up the things that truly matter, like your right to breathe in privacy and your ability to make those decisions. Because when you've given up your privacy, you've made it that much easier for others to control you. If I can come to you and say, I know what you look at on the internet when no one's here, what's your instant gut feeling? Because everyone in the world, whether you're looking at some horrible things or not, we look up our medical conditions, we look up our weird symptoms, we look up stuff we don't want to go yell from the top of a building. Our finances, all of this stuff.
Why would they be keeping our phone data? Why would they be building giant data centers collecting information on our buying habits and our credit card use and on our voting habits if we are not under investigation? So they're doing all of this, treating us as criminals when we're not doing anything. And what's happening instead? Terrorist attacks still going on. They're not catching them. Or they're catching them when the FBI finds some poor little schmuck who has nasty thoughts in his head but has no means of committing a terrorist act, and the FBI goes in and the FBI supplies him with everything he needs to commit a terrorist act, right down to the fake bomb, and they take him right to the site where he can plant the fake bomb, and then they bust him.
In December of 2010, David Codrea and Mike Vanderboegh were contacted by outraged ATF agents concerning the directives of the hierarchy in the ATF. It was a scandal so big that it could have cost Barack Obama his presidency. Members of his administration were guilty of some egregious actions, but the obedient media helped to hide or minimize that from the people of the United States. It was a Herculean effort to break the story.
They're willing to kill over this. They killed hundreds of Mexicans in Fast and Furious. That wasn't an accident. That was the intended purpose of Fast and Furious, to rack up a body count in Mexico so that they could discredit the Second Amendment in the United States of America.
You found out about the Fast and Furious scandal. You broke it, much like how Watergate happened, and those two supporters, I think they're Woodward and Bernstein, they were seen as heroes, and yet nobody even knows about you guys.
We were largely ignored, in part because when you're a so-called citizen journalist, when you do most of your work on the internet, you're not perceived as being legitimate, number one.
I think the relevance of Operation Fast and Furious is that the United States government does not consider itself above breaking the law and above allowing people to die as a result of their very cynical and what I consider to be evil actions. Now, I've seen that dismissed by some, and for those who don't really understand what it was about, the ATF was pressuring gun stores to allow sales to go through, which they knew were being part of what they call straw purchasing, and which they knew then was going across the border to Mexico. They kept their own attaché, their own ATF attaché in Mexico, out of the loop on this. And when he found out about this, they would not allow him to be an interface with his counterparts in the Mexican government. They kept the Mexican government out of the loop on this. At least that's the story that they tell. And as a result, what was happening was American guns were being found at crime scenes in Mexico, and this was then being used to point at and say, see, we have a problem with guns bought in the United States due to lax gun laws and due to them allowing assault weapons ending up in Mexico and being used to murder people, when in fact this was engineered by the government's cynical program.
We knew about what had happened with Brian Terry the next day. We had sources in the ATF that were telling us he was killed. He was killed with a weapon that came out of Fast and Furious. Fast and Furious was an effort to let guns walk to Mexico, and that the whole program was designed to build up headlines to get a new assault weapons ban going. Very critical. All this we had heard the day after. I mean, his body wasn't cold and we knew about it. That's how good our sources in ATF were. But we didn't trust them. We suspected that Fast and Furious was disinformation because we guarded our reputation for honesty. And it was in the interests of our enemies in the federal bureaucracy to discredit us. And all you need is one screw up and you're discredited. Why would they come to us? Good question. They came to us because we had been working ATF scandals, us meaning David Codrea and I. We had been working ATF scandals for some years at that point. And they knew two things about us. They knew that we would never, ever give up a source. That we would die before we gave up a source. That was the first thing. And the second thing was that whatever the truth was, it was the truth that mattered to us. And so there was a lot of back and forth email on what we call the Desert Telegraph, which we didn't even know where it ended. It involved people that we trusted, who were talking with people that they trusted, who were talking with people that they trusted, and then it got to the source. So we would pass questions down, they would pass answers back. Sometimes they would pass questions up and we would pass answers back. It was a communication of trust. And yet we hesitated. And finally we said, look, there was a website, cleanupatf.org, that the dissident agents had begun. And we said, look, we can run with the story if you mention it on cleanupatf.org. And of course, they mentioned it on cleanupatf.org. And the next day, I did the first story in the wider web. Weapons that killed Brian Terry came out of this. They were weapons that the ATF knew about, that they feared, and that began the whole Fast and Furious thing.
I've seen this described overwhelmingly in the media as the phrase is botched gun sting. That is absolutely unmitigated garbage. It was not a botched gun sting because a gun sting presupposes that you're going to follow the guns and that you're going to find the person at the other end, and you're somehow or other going to make an arrest and everybody's going to save the day.
See, they were leaning on the gun dealers to sell to straw buyers. But then they were ordered not to follow the straw buyers when they handed over the weapons to the middlemen who were actually conveying the weapons across the border. And then the ATF was entrusted with the second part of the conspiracy, which was matching the serial numbers from the weapons that had been provided to the straw buyers when they were found next to bodies in Mexico.
And if I got this straight, wasn't one of those guns actually kill a police officer?
What happened was a Border Patrol agent by the name of Brian Terry was out at night, and they came across a rip crew, basically some Mexican criminals that they got into a firefight. The Border Patrol apparently only had beanbag rounds to fire back with. They were open fire on with semi-automatic rifle fire, and at the scene they found two weapons that they were able to trace back to gun store that was part of the Fast and Furious operation being managed by the Phoenix Field Division of the ATF. So it wasn't until the Fast and Furious operation got exposed through the death of Border Patrol agent Brian Terry that all of a sudden now this again becomes a purview of the House Oversight Committee. But that itself did not happen automatically. Vanderboegh and I both continued to press on this, and we wrote something like probably around 150 reports until such time as finally it got picked up by CBS News, and Agent John Dodson was interviewed, and at that point the story broke on a national level. Yeah. But again, I can show you articles written long before that and along the way where we were begging the media to notice this and to test what we were saying for themselves, where we were begging House Oversight to get involved, where we were begging Senate Judiciary to get involved.
But we exposed it, right? Theoretically, there should have been oversight hearings on the ATF and FBI. Theoretically, the FBI should have been called to explain this, right? What happens immediately afterwards? John Boehner shows up in the office of Darrell Issa and says, "You will not investigate the FBI."
We have seen hearings. We have seen the Attorney General have a contempt of Congress charge leveled against him. We have seen that go absolutely nowhere in the courts as it stalls and goes on. Now Holder really isn't much of a target anymore because he's no longer in office.
And we couldn't get anybody to pay attention. We tried various politicians, senators, congressmen. Nobody was picking up on this. The one book that dealt with us at all with a modicum of seriousness is Cheryl Atkinson's book. Stonewalled is the name of the book. And she mentions this in there that we were the ones that broke the story. And in truth, she got the story from us. The senators got the story from us, and then she contacted us. Other national journalists had done so. And we did what we did for them was we would pass their proposals down the line, and then they would come back, yay or nay. But Cheryl got the story because, number one, she was an inveterate seeker of the truth. And most importantly, she got the story because she was sensitive to the needs of the whistleblowers. She'd worked with whistleblowers before. She understood that they're hanging out there flapping in the breeze, and they need to tell their story as best they can with what they're comfortable with.
Reporters like Cheryl Atkinson, which were doing great work digging into Fast and Furious, Benghazi, other scandals, they couldn't get a minute on CBS. She's like a award-winning reporter, a fantastic investigative journalist. They wouldn't give her a second on CBS. She ended up having to tweet out her scoops, or for a while she was putting them on the CBS website. but they wouldn't give her a minute on their national news show.
Well, the media says lots of things, and we know the media invented fake news. Ever since the reports coming out of, say, Vietnam, when some 40 years ago, an American victory was described as an American defeat. That's fake news. It wasn't invented this year or during the Obama administration. This is what the media has done.
They don't need to have the entire media either. All they have to do is have a quorum of the media, which I use for shorthand ABC, CNN, NBC, CBS, PBS. If they have them, if those networks won't report something, it might as well not have happened. If it's just Fox News that mentions something happening, then they just say, oh, that's only Fox, that's the right-wingers. So you have a very corrupt system where the people that are running the regime are so cozily tied in with the major media, they can just embargo a story, and it just didn't happen. I mean, to the mass of Americans that aren't news fanatics, news junkies, that are just, sports and entertainment people, they'll never hear of these scandals. I think Fast and Furious, remember, we're talking hundreds of dead Mexicans on purpose. I would say that today, 80% of Americans, if they ever heard of Fast and Furious, they think it's a movie with Paul Walker.
Yeah.
But again, I can show you articles written long before that and along the way where we were begging the media to notice this and to test what we were saying for themselves. Okay, there's so many things that just stink, and the administration was in your face. We're not going to tell you anything. They were allowed to get away with it, and they were abetted by a media that wanted them to get away with it.
A government capable of enabling the murders of hundreds, perhaps thousands of Mexican nationals and a few American law enforcement officers in order to pass legislation to get an assault weapons ban and increased scrutiny of gun stores is capable of anything. And whether you believe all of it or not, it does seem like some reporter somewhere ought to have a bit of curiosity, but they didn't. They couldn't be bothered with something negative about their president.
I wish that people had faith, but and I kind of in a sense it's part of this entire sub rosa Marxist process that's been going on for a century. The Italian writer Antonio Gramsci in the 1920s, he you can kind of put him opposite Lenin. Same era. Lenin had the idea that we're going to, through a coup, force communism on Russia, build Russia up to be a powerful communist country, and through subversion and violence, one after another, we're just going to take over each country in turn. And Antonio Gramsci said that's not going to work, and he was right, because the Italian people still love their church and love their country. They're not just going to be thrown into being communists because some subversives come in or there's some terrorism. So Gramsci came up with the concept of what we now refer to as the Long March through the institutions, the Long March being a reference to Mao Zedong at the end of World War II before he came to power, the Long March through the institutions, meaning we're going to subvert the PTA, we're going to subvert the school board, we're going to go to every meeting of anybody. The conservatives are just interested in making money and having babies. They don't care about this stuff, the infrastructure of society. We're going to, like termites, work our way in. We're going to take over academia. Done, check. The media, done, check. Journalism schools today are just Marxism schools. They don't say that, but they're about social justice. They're not about informing the population about the current problems and threats to society. Journalism today is social justice advocacy, meaning Marxism. So yeah, we're now 100 years after Gramsci. We have no love of our country. The Howard Zinn history of America is we're just an evil imperialist bunch of, racists who deserve to be taken down. We should be taken down. So how do you defeat a country like the United States of America? get it to not even defend itself.
And that's what I'm seeing in our military. I'm not seeing any generals resigning. Transgenders in the military, but this is called sabotage. And you can't say a word about it because that's their choice. This is a military which is being driven to destruction. If this military has to fight a real war, it's going to be annihilated.
Is it frustrating to see so many people who are oblivious to the struggle that you see taking place?
Of course, it's frustrating when people don't understand and when they don't even care, and when they're standing in the middle of train tracks with a train rushing at them and they don't see the train because their mindset does not admit that in this country we could have an onrushing train of tyranny coming at us.
That's what tyrants count on. They count on people being psychologically conditioned not to react, to embrace what they have known as some sort of constant that's always going to be there. And I tell you as a student of history, that is almost always not true.
I wish that people cared more about freedom, but I don't think your generation, to speak broadly, really cares about freedom or thinks about it. Freedom is something that you think is like the air. It's like a birthright. Like I turn the water tap and water comes out. I flip the switch, a light comes on, and I'm an American, so I'm free. And I don't need to think about this. But you do need to think about this. We're at the point now that there's a crime syndicate that has literally taken over this country to the point where the FBI director took a dive, threw away his integrity, threw away his soul. I can't express to you how dangerous that is. The FBI, this would be like hearing that your childhood pediatrician is poisoning the nursery, is putting drugs in the milk at the hospital. This is a disgrace. It's a shame. I'm waiting for FBI agents to stand up, and they're not. And I don't understand why not. Are they afraid? Are they cowards? Is it that the most FBI agents at the special agent level, they're just down here, GS-13, GS-14. At the senior executive service, are they picked for their lack of integrity? Are they elevated to management within federal law enforcement based on their ability to go along, to get along, to be a team player and not make waves? Where is their integrity?
If I had a nickel for every time that I've actually had to sit down and cry because everything that I knew or thought I knew, everything I believed in, everything that I cheered and supported and fought for, gone to rallies for, traveled across the country to DC to stand in solidarity, I was wrong. I was wrong. And to some extent, I helped enable the chains that are on you. And that is a very heavy burden. Don't be like me. Stand up and say no. I don't care what everybody else is doing. I don't care what has been done before me. I am smart enough, I'm good enough, and I am strong enough to see there is a problem, and I don't care what you're doing. I'm going to stand. I'm going to do something to stop this. Because if you don't, your kid is going to be asking you someday, why do I have a chip? Why can't I go to the store? Why can't I ride my bike? Why can't I? Why can't you? That's the question.
I know you know about the Order of the White Rose, and what is that and what's its significance?
So we teach, the White Rose teaches a lot of different skills to help people keep their freedom among a variety of situations, from natural disasters to government overreach. As we all know, the government is very interested in curbing who you are and what you do. And we purposely took our name from a group during Nazi Germany. There was a group of college students, a group of millennials, I guess you would call them at this point, that had the guts to stand up to the Nazi Empire. And all they did was they wrote pamphlets and little brochures that they would disseminate in the thousands. And back then, it's not like it was as easy as typing it out on a computer and emailing it. They did this by hand. And they were talking about the exact same things: the freedom to think for yourself, the freedom to make your own decisions, the freedom to be who you are without the government coming and carting you off. And they challenged the German people during that time to do that, to look around and say, is this what you want? Is this the kind of people you want to be? the things you want to allow, and the Nazi Empire took them and cut their heads off.
You know, the stakes are now so high, as Julian Assange of WikiLeaks said the other day, the stakes are really enormous. You know, they're willing to kill over this. So when, you know, Michael Hastings dies in a fiery crash with his brand new Mercedes going 140 in like a 40-mile-an-hour zone, a Bluetooth-enabled Mercedes. I forget if it was Hayden or one of the former CIA directors in I believe it was Esquire magazine or maybe Rolling Stone, said absolutely, they can hijack a Bluetooth-enabled car and make it do anything that they want. The car slammed into a tree at like 130 miles an hour. It's top speed. Seth Rich was shot in the back the other day. He was supposedly going to see the FBI. He was sneaking out of his house in Washington at 4 a.m. on a Sunday morning, allegedly to meet the FBI. He was killed. So that I think that we're in very perilous territory now, and I'm I'm extremely disturbed by it.
Now, I'm sure Matt would tell you that he doesn't know for sure what happened to Michael Hastings or Seth Rich. But there are scandals that we know of that the government and the media conspired to cover up. So to that end, they've lost any credibility and only feed conspiracy theory. Until years later, and it's confirmed as a conspiracy fact. By then, the people are out of office and they wind up getting away with it. If no one ever gets punished, it encourages more and more until we wind up here with a totally diseased government. The drift of the government toward control and communist principles has allowed the government at all levels to lock down the population, cost people their businesses, and enforce travel restrictions on the supposedly free people. All over something that is now recognized as little more than a dangerous flu season. That's how they did it, because we have followed this progression too far. It's time to start working away from that progression, but how?
My view of the Constitution is that it's better than what we have right now. That's been my view of it for a long time. I think the Bill of Rights and the Declaration of Independence are among the most brilliant and important documents ever written by human beings, but the Constitution is simply a framework of government. And in our case, it was a framework of big government. I think the effort to restore it is futile, because if the Constitution itself, if the words on that paper have not been able to keep government from growing beyond all reasonable bounds, then a new set of words or a new set of actions is not going to do that either. There's been talk of a new constitutional convention to rewrite the Constitution, but even if you do that, it's just words on paper. And what's even more frightening is that good-hearted people are going to want a constitutional convention, and it's going to be taken over by big government people who are going to write an even worse constitution than we already have, that will permit even worse abuses. So I'm totally against it. I think the freedom will best be restored through individuals simply taking back their own freedom and the freedom of their communities.
That was the lesson of Waco. Catch-22. They can do anything we can't stop them from doing. That's where the militia movement came from. Mm-hmm. If the Republican Party, a misnamed party if there ever was one, if the GOP couldn't protect us politically, couldn't protect our Second Amendment rights politically, if they couldn't roll back some of the infringements on our liberty politically, mm-hmm. if all we were left was, as the Irish say, ourselves alone, Americans are practical people. We'll make our own arrangements if nobody else is going to do it. That's what the militia movement was. Mm-hmm. We were making our own arrangements to protect our own liberty from the guys who were saying we can do anything you can't stop us from doing. And we said, as Americans, okay, what do we need to do to stop them?
Our wealth in this country is due to a biblically based, limited government constitutional regime that was established to release the energy of the people, initially to free us from the regulatory excesses of King George, who tried to enforce his excesses with soldiers. And we know how that turned out. And that's why we have a Second Amendment, because we were born learning that ultimately a regulatory excess might need to be countered by an armed people. They saw there was pushback from an armed people in 1947 in Athens, Tennessee. And so, not often, happily, but from time to time, the American people have had to remind the government, we're the boss.
But this country is really tiptoeing towards a precipice. And I don't think that 1 out of 10 people that are, walking around looking at smartphones is even conscious of this, in any way conscious of this. But it's going to be a brutal wake-up call. And, for a lot of people, the first sign of trouble might be the light doesn't come on when they flip the switch. Yeah, it's one of the things I admire about Trump. He might be a really bad Christian, but at least he's a fighter. We need some fighters. We don't have fighters. Most of the conservative, what they call Conservatism Inc., these think tank wonks, the bow-tied conservatives, they've all run away. They're all cowards. All they care about is the paycheck from their think tank, from their foundation. But as soon as the going is tough, they just run away. They abandon ship.
There's a lot of things that I disagree with Pat Buchanan on, a lot. But he characterized the two major parties as two wings of the same bird of prey. And that is certainly true. My fidelity is to the Constitution. My fidelity is to the Founders' Republic. That's the one that I took an oath to protect against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And in my life, I've experienced the fact that both parties violate the Constitution however they see is necessary for their own advancement.
You're made for more than this. You're made for something other than being a cog in a machine where you just exist to pay taxes to a bunch of people that are just going to tell you how to live anyway. Go back to every story you've ever heard about people who rise up against their tyrants. It's a timeless story because that's the core of who we are. We are hardwired to rise. We are hardwired to fight.
Appetites for tyrants are insatiable, and they always want more of your property, more of your liberty, even at the cost of your lives. Nobody since Mein Kampf can believe that something somebody writes, some appetite that some wannabe dictator expresses can be ignored. Mm-hmm. Hitler laid it all out in Mein Kampf. Right? Marx laid it all out. Lenin laid it all out. Every collectivist who ever wrote lays out their appetites for your liberty and your property, mm-hmm. and they've got perfectly wonderful reasons, velvety, humane reasons that they wrap around their iron fist. But the essence is, you will do what we say.
Where do you see the future for the United States?
The future of the United States. I'm not sure the United States has a future. And I'm not sure that that's a bad thing either. But I feel that we're in a state of decay and decline mm-hmm. that could result in the breakup of the United States, or even if not a formal breakup of the United States, could still result in people basically so much going their own way that the United States as an entity becomes irrelevant. Mm. And then we need to be so kick-ass strong in who we are and what we believe that nobody is going to force us to do what we know is wrong. No one is going to force us not to be free.